When I was 12, my mom had just started trusting me enough to stay home alone. We lived in a quiet town, wide streets, tidy lawns, neighbors who waved from their porches. It was the kind of place where nobody locked their doors until late, and danger felt far away. That weekend, my parents were headed out, leaving me for the first time with the house to myself. Before they left, they handed me a 20 and told me to order from Gianni's Pizzeria, the place everybody used, though it's long gone now. I remember the empty driveway under the yellow glow of a single street lamp, the house silent except for the hum of my old game console. At 12, I thought nothing could touch me here. But as the night settled in, I learned just how quickly that sense of safety can slip away. The night carried on as it always did in that neighborhood, still with only the distant sound of cars on the main road and the steady hum of crickets outside. Inside, the boy tried to settle into the rhythm of being alone, the warmth of the house and the familiar flicker of the TV screen giving him a sense of routine. The pizza box from Gianni's sat on the kitchen counter, steam curling out from under the lid. He ate in silence, telling himself that nothing was out of the ordinary. It wasn't until the doorbell rang that the first ripple of unease disturbed the calm. The sound cut through the quiet, sharper than it should have been. He paused his game and walked to the door, cash in hand, already picturing the greasy slice of pepperoni he'd been waiting for. Through the peephole, he spotted the delivery man, late 40s, with a really long, scraggly beard, a black trucker's hat pulled low, and thick glasses that caught the porch light. The man's shirt looked like it might have once matched the old Gianni's uniforms, but the colors had faded, and there was something off about the way he stood, shoulders slouched and eyes darting. When he opened the door, the man didn't smile. Instead, he handed over the pizza and asked, "You alone here?" The question landed with a weight the boy couldn't quite name. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might materialize behind him. "No, my parents are home," he answered, voice thin. The delivery man's lips curled into a half-smile, but he didn't say anything else. He took the cash, turned, and shuffled back to his car, a battered sedan with a missing hubcap. Leaving the boy in the doorway, the air suddenly thick with something unspoken. He closed the door and flicked the deadbolt, trying to shake the feeling that had crept in. Maybe the guy was just tired. Maybe he asked everyone that question. But the way he'd looked at him, the way his voice had lingered, made it hard to let go. The boy tried to lose himself in his game and the comfort of melted cheese, but every sound in the house seemed louder now. He caught himself glancing at the windows, checking the lock on the door again, listening for footsteps that weren't there. A half hour passed, and the tension seemed to fade. He convinced himself he was overreacting, that he'd let his imagination get the better of him. The night outside was unchanged, and the house felt small, but safe. He stretched out on the couch, letting the TV fill the silence. Then the doorbell rang again. This time he didn't move right away. The sound was more jarring, coming out of nowhere. He crept to the door, careful to stay out of sight, and peered through the peephole. He didn't see anyone. The porch was empty, shadows pooling under the eaves. He waited, breath held, but nothing happened. He told himself it was just a prank, maybe some neighborhood kid, maybe a mistake. Then, a third ring. And this time, a voice, a man's voice, unfamiliar and rough, called out, "Hey, I need help. I need to use a phone." The words sounded practiced, like he'd said them before. The boy's heart hammered in his chest. He didn't answer. He pressed himself flat against the wall, listening. The voice came again, closer to the door. "Wait, please, I need help." He could hear the desperation in the man's tone, but it was forced, too insistent. Something about it didn't fit. The boy's mind raced. He remembered the delivery man's question, the way he'd looked at him, the timing of this stranger now asking to come inside. He backed away from the door, hands shaking, and grabbed the phone. He called his mom, whispering what was happening, voice barely steady. She told him to stay put, to lock every door, and that she would call the police. He could hear the fear in her voice, low and urgent, but she tried to keep it calm for his sake. He hung up and checked the locks again, moving from door to door, eyes flicking to every window. The voice outside didn't go away. The man started banging on the door, harder this time, repeating, "Wait, please. I need help." The sound echoed through the house, each thud making the boy flinch. He backed into the hallway, trying to make himself small, listening for any sign that the man was leaving. Then, from the side of the house, he heard the metal latch of the backyard gate swing open. The noise was sharp, unmistakable. The boy froze, every instinct telling him to hide. He slipped down the hallway, pressing himself against the wall, barely breathing. He heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside the kitchen window. The back porch light cast a faint glow across the yard, but he didn't dare look out. He just listened. Footsteps circling, a shadow moving past the blinds, the sound of someone trying the handle of the back door. He dialed 911, whispering into the phone, "Someone's outside. He's trying to get in." The dispatcher's voice was calm, asking for his address, telling him to stay on the line. The boy crouched low, phone pressed to his ear, every muscle tensed. The banging started again, this time at the back door. The man's voice was lower now, almost a growl. "I know you're in there." He didn't answer. He didn't move. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud in the silence between each thud on the door. He remembered his mom's instructions. "Stay put. Don't open the door. The police are on their way." But the minutes stretched out, slow and heavy, and the sounds outside kept coming. Footsteps along the side of the house, the squeak of the gate closing, another bang at the kitchen door. The boy pressed himself further into the shadows, hoping the darkness would keep him hidden. The house, once so familiar, felt alien now, every creak and groan a warning, every shadow a threat. The boy's world had shrunk to the space behind the locked door, the thin line of light under the kitchen table, the voice on the other end of the phone promising that help was coming. He didn't know how long he waited, only that the sounds outside seemed to move in waves, banging, footsteps, silence, and then more banging. He stayed where he was, listening, waiting, every second stretching longer than the last as the threat outside pressed closer. A child's instinct in the moment of danger is raw and immediate, stripped of anything but the need to survive. For the boy, that instinct took over as soon as he realized the threat outside wasn't going away. He heard the doorknob rattle, the metal clinking in a way that left no room for doubt. Someone was trying to get in. The ordinary sounds of his home had twisted into signals of danger. The house that had always felt solid now seemed porous, every wall and window suddenly vulnerable. He clutched the phone, but a cold realization hit him. The only working phone upstairs was in his parents' bedroom. That meant crossing the hallway, leaving the thin safety of his own room, risking a glimpse of whatever waited on the other side of the door. The urge to freeze battled with the need to act. He forced himself to move, slipping out of his room and darting down the hall, every step a gamble. The house was silent, except for his breathing, and the distant, persistent sounds at the back of the house. He reached his parents' bedroom, shut the door, and locked it behind him, heart pounding so hard He thought it might give him away. He dialed his mother's number with shaking fingers. The line connected, and her voice spilled out, tight and urgent. He tried to explain what was happening, voice barely above a whisper, but the words tumbled out in a rush. She listened, panic leaking through her attempts at calm. "Lock the door, push the dresser in front of it, hide," she said, each command sharper than the last. He obeyed, dragging the heavy dresser across the carpet until it wedged against the door. The scrape of wood sounded impossibly loud, but he didn't stop until the door was barricaded. Inside, the room felt smaller than he remembered. He pressed himself into the corner, phone pressed to his ear, listening for anything that might signal the intruder's next move. His mother's voice was the only thing tethering him to the outside world. "Stay quiet. Don't move. The police are coming," she whispered, her words clipped by fear. He nodded even though she couldn't see him, clutching the phone so hard his hand hurt. That's when he heard it. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, heavy enough to make the floorboards groan. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was inside. He squeezed his eyes shut, barely breathing, every muscle locked in place. The footsteps paused outside his parents' bedroom door. For a moment there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating. Then the doorknob turned. It rattled, then stopped. The person on the other side pushed, testing the barricade. The boy pressed himself further into the shadows, the phone slick in his palm. His mother must have heard the noise through the receiver. Her voice shot through the silence, high-pitched and ragged, screaming for the police to hurry, to get there now. Her panic spilling over in a way he'd never heard before. The intruder didn't speak. Instead, there was a slow, scraping sound, as if fingers were dragging along the wood of the door. The boy's mind raced with what-ifs, every scenario worse than the last. He remembered every safety lesson his parents had ever drilled into him. Don't open the door, stay hidden, wait for help. But nothing could prepare him for the reality of being hunted inside his own home. Time stretched and twisted. The boy couldn't tell if it had been minutes or hours since he'd first heard the footsteps. He tried to make himself invisible, curling up behind the bed, knees drawn to his chest, phone clutched in both hands. His mother's voice was a lifeline, but even that began to fade beneath the terror that pressed in on all sides. The footsteps eventually retreated, fading down the stairs. He listened, straining to catch any sound that might warn him of a return. Then, from somewhere downstairs, he heard the unmistakable sound of the back door slamming open. It was followed by a rush of footsteps, more hurried, more desperate. The boy tensed, waiting for the next move, every nerve on edge. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos, the distant wail of sirens. Faint at first, but growing louder. The boy's mother heard it too. Her voice broke, relief and fear tangled together as she told him to stay put, not to move, no matter what happened next. Flashing lights spilled through the windows, blue and red painting the walls in shifting patterns. Doors slammed outside, voices shouted, authoritative, controlled, nothing like the threats that had haunted the house moments before. The boy stayed hidden, just as he'd been told, until a police officer's voice called his name, calm and steady. He crawled out from behind the bed, legs unsteady, and opened the door to see two officers standing in the hallway. Their presence was a shock, real, solid, a barrier between him and whatever had been inside the house. They checked every room, their radios crackling with updates. Downstairs, they found the back door ajar and the sliding window in the kitchen wide open. The officer knelt to inspect the lock, then turned to the boy, voice low. "He got in through here." The confirmation sent a chill through him. The intruder hadn't just tried to get inside. He'd made it, slipping through the window and moving through the house while the boy hid upstairs. The police found muddy footprints on the kitchen tile and a set of prints on the stairs, proof of how close the danger had come. The boy's mother, still on the phone, listened as the officer explained what they'd found. Her voice broke, a mixture of relief and horror. The officers walked the boy through the house, pointing out where the intruder had moved, how he'd avoided the front of the house, how he'd slipped out the back when the sirens approached. They reassured him that he'd done everything right, locked the doors, called for help, stayed hidden. The boy tried to take comfort in their words, but the evidence was all around him. The open door, the muddy prints, the overturned chair in the kitchen. When his parents finally arrived, the reunion was quiet and shaken. His mother hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe, and his father's hands trembled as he checked the locks himself. The police finished their search, took statements, and promised to patrol the neighborhood through the night. No one slept much. The house that had always been a sanctuary now felt exposed, every shadow a possible threat. The boy lay in bed, listening to the sounds outside, cars on the distant road, the wind in the trees, the occasional crackle of a police radio from the cruiser parked out front. The sense of safety he'd once taken for granted was gone, replaced by the knowledge that danger could find its way in, even here. The next day, sunlight crept through the windows, washing the rooms in pale gold. The boy walked through the house with new eyes, noticing every lock, every window, every place where the night before had left its mark. He would never forget the feeling of being hunted in his own home, the way fear can turn familiar spaces into a maze of uncertainty. Sometimes isolation brings a quiet that feels safe. Other times, it only sharpens the sense of being watched, of being alone with what waits outside. After the family left California and settled in North Idaho, the sense of isolation was different, deeper, almost absolute. The new house stood at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by nothing but dense forest and open fields. It was the kind of place that seemed designed to keep the world out. The house itself was impressive for a teenager. A home gym, a bar tucked into the basement, a movie theater with blackout curtains. For most, it would have felt like a fortress. But in March 2022, during spring break, that illusion would be tested. He was 17, and his parents had driven into town for dinner, leaving him alone with the family dog. The quiet was familiar and welcome. He moved through the empty rooms, the only sounds the shuffle of his socks on hardwood and the occasional bark from the dog. He finished up his chores, then headed to the bar room, cracked open a beer, underage, but the rules felt different out here, and settled in to watch a movie. The movie theater's darkness was comforting, a cocoon that blocked out the world. For a while, the night felt normal, but as the credits rolled, he noticed something strange. The dog, usually content to sleep through anything, suddenly sat upright, ears perked and eyes fixed on the window. He muted the TV and listened. At first, there was nothing. Then a faint tapping, almost polite, against the glass of the movie room window. He sat frozen, beer halfway to his lips, every sense straining to make sense of the sound. The tapping stopped. Silence returned, but the unease lingered, thickening the air. He brushed it off, blaming the wind or a stray branch, and moved to the bar room to pour another drink. That's when he heard it again, 3 deliberate taps, this time on the bar room window. He turned and stared, heart thudding. There was nothing outside but darkness, the porch light barely reaching the edge of the woods. The dog growled low, a sound he'd never heard her make before. He stood there, bottle in hand, trying to convince himself it was nothing. The feeling of being watched crept in slowly, then all at once. He moved through the house, checking every window and door. Each lock clicked into place with a finality that felt both reassuring and futile. The unease didn't fade. Instead, it grew sharper, settling into his bones. He turned on every light, hoping to push back the shadows pressing in from the forest. He tried to distract himself, texting friends, scrolling through his phone, but the sense of surveillance wouldn't let go. Every time he glanced at a window, he half expected to see a face staring back. The house, with all its amenities and comforts, suddenly felt like a cage. He told himself to relax, that he was letting his imagination run wild, but the dog wouldn't settle. She paced the length of the living room, stopping to sniff at the front door, then the back, then the hallway that led to his bedroom. Curiosity and a growing sense of dread finally pushed him outside. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The cold air bit at his skin. The beams swept over the yard, catching nothing but the glint of dew on grass. He moved around the house, the dog at his side, and that's when he saw them. Footprints in the soft earth, fresh and unmistakable. They circled the house, stopping at every ground-level window, including the movie room and bar room. Each print was deliberate, pressed deep into the mud, the stride uneven and close together. Someone had moved slowly, pausing at each window, close enough to peer inside. He followed the trail as far as he could, but it vanished at the tree line. The forest loomed, silent and impenetrable. He backed toward the house, locking the door behind him, adrenaline surging. He checked every window again, pulling curtains tight, turning off lights to keep from being silhouetted. The dog whined, tail tucked, refusing to leave his side. He returned to the living room, shotgun now resting across his lap, the weight of it unfamiliar but necessary. He'd never had to use it before. The house felt impossibly large, every dark corner a potential hiding place. He waited, heart pounding, eyes darting from window to window. The hours crawled by. Every sound, the groan of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, made him jump. Then came the footsteps. Light, measured, almost careful, moving around the house. He held his breath, straining to listen. The footsteps paused outside the movie room, then the bar room. Another round of tapping, slow and deliberate. He gripped the shotgun tighter, sweat slicking his palms. The dog barked, a sharp warning, then retreated behind the couch. He called his parents, but their phones went straight to voicemail. He considered dialing the police, but the nearest station was miles away. He felt trapped, every instinct telling him to hide, to make himself small. But something in him pushed back. He stood, shotgun raised, and moved to the living room window. The tapping stopped. A face appeared at the glass, half lit by the porch light. The man's features were distorted, a grin stretched wide, eyes glinting with something wild. He held a knife, tapping it against the window, each tap deliberate and slow. The teenager's body moved before his mind could catch up. He aimed through the glass and fired. The blast shattered the night, blowing out the window. When the smoke cleared, the man was gone. No running footsteps, no rustle in the brush, just empty yard and broken glass. He waited, shotgun ready, until the police arrived. They found nothing but footprints and glass. The prints circled the house, stopped at every window, then disappeared into the woods. No explanation, no motive. The officers took statements, swept the property, and left him with a warning to stay vigilant. His parents returned, shaken but grateful he was safe. They replaced the locks, installed new lights, and kept the shotgun close. But the sense of safety never fully returned. Every night after, he watched the shadows gather at the edge of the trees, never quite sure if the watcher was gone for good. Sometimes, what happens in the woods stays hidden, leaving only questions and a lingering sense of unease. And sometimes, the boundary between sanctuary and threat is thinner than anyone wants to believe. For 6 college friends, 3 guys, 2 girls, and the narrator, spring break in South Carolina was supposed to be a reset. They wanted a place far from campus and the noise of city life, somewhere cheap and isolated enough to feel like a real escape. The cabin they found online promised all that. The listing called it a scenic gem tucked away in nature, and the photos showed a rustic porch, sunlight in the trees, and a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere but peace. When they arrived, the setting looked almost right. The cabin sat at the end of a winding track, surrounded by thick woods that pressed in from every side. But up close, the place felt neglected. The porch sagged, boards soft and green with moss. Shutters hung at odd angles, and the windows were streaked with grime. It didn't match the photos, but after a long drive, no one wanted to complain. One of the guys tried to joke about the place having character, but nobody really laughed. Inside, the cabin felt less like a rental, and more like a space caught between use and abandonment. Dust coated the shelves. The air was heavy with the smell of old wood and something damp. Still, someone had been there recently. Clean sheets folded on the beds, a short note on the table welcoming them, and a few kitchen supplies stacked neatly. The group shrugged it off. They'd all stayed in worse places. Bags hit the floor, beds were claimed, and the first night began with pizza, beer, and card games around the fireplace. For a while, the oddness faded behind the comfort of old friendships. The fire snapped and popped, and for a few hours the cabin felt almost warm. But as the night deepened, the sense of unease crept back in. It started small. Claire, one of the girls, went out to the car for her sweater and came back unsettled. She'd seen something move in the trees, just a shape maybe, but enough to make her skin crawl. She tried to laugh it off, but the tension in her voice was obvious. The others offered the easy explanations: a deer, a stray dog, a trick of the light. But as the hours passed, little things kept happening. A jacket left by the door was later found in the middle of the room, arms splayed out as if someone had arranged it. A glass that had been set on the counter was discovered on the floor, unbroken but far from where it started. The group tried to blame it on the wind or their own forgetfulness, but each new detail made the cabin feel less like a retreat and more like a place that didn't want them there. Just before midnight, the unease broke into panic. Jason, one of the guys, went to the kitchen for water and came back pale and shaking. He told them there was someone outside the window. The group crowded together, careful not to get too close to the glass. At first, they saw nothing. Then a figure stepped into the edge of the porch light. The man was almost naked, his body streaked with scratches and dirt. He stood at the window, head cocked at a strange angle, eyes fixed on the group inside. He didn't move or speak. He just watched. The group's fear turned immediate and physical. They grabbed what they could: a kitchen knife, a fire poker, a heavy chair leg. Nobody argued about what to do next. Caleb, the oldest, told everyone to stay together and keep away from the doors and windows. The man outside never tried to get in. He didn't knock or rattle the handles. After a few long minutes, he melted back into the woods, swallowed by the darkness. Sleep was out of the question. Some of them pressed themselves against the walls, weapons in hand, eyes darting to every window. Others huddled together on the couch, flinching at every creak and distant animal cry. A dog barked somewhere in the woods, sharp and frantic. The group listened, wondering if it was warning them or just reacting to the same presence. At first light, nobody needed to be convinced to leave. They packed in silence, stuffing clothes and food into bags, not bothering to fold or organize. The drive to town was quiet. When they reached the local sheriff's office, they told the deputy what happened. He listened without much reaction. When they finished, he just nodded and said, "Yeah, we've had some trouble with folks squatting up in those woods." The line was flat, practiced, and it made their fear feel small. The deputy didn't offer to send anyone out or take a statement. He just told them it was probably nothing to worry about. That answer stuck with them. They left the office more unsettled than before, their story dismissed as a local oddity. They tried to contact the cabin's owner, hoping for some explanation or at least a refund. Their messages went unanswered. Within days, the rental listing vanished from the website. The deposit was never returned. It was as if the cabin had been erased, leaving no trace that it was ever meant to be found. Back at school, the story followed them. It came up in late-night conversations, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the way they glanced at windows when the world got too quiet. They all remembered the man's face, the way he watched without blinking, the scratches on his chest. It wasn't a ghost story or a rumor. It was something that happened to them, something no one else seemed to take seriously. Years later, they still bring it up. The details never change. The man in the woods, the cabin that disappeared, the silence of the local police. Sometimes they wonder what would have happened if they hadn't seen him. If they'd gone to bed and left the doors unlocked. If he'd come inside while they slept. The thought lingers, quiet and persistent. What remains is not just the memory of fear, but the knowledge that safety can vanish in an instant. It's not always the violence itself that haunts you, but the understanding that the places you trust, cabins, houses, even your own mind, can be invaded by something you never expect. And that realization is often the hardest to shake. The real horror of vulnerability is not just a theme running beneath these stories, it's the thread that binds them together. When the places we trust most become sites of fear, we're forced to confront how little stands between us and those who mean us harm. The illusion of safety, built over years by routines and habits, is always thinner than we want to believe. Each account here unfolds with a quiet beginning. It's not a dramatic break-in or a shriek in the night that signals the start. It's a question at the door that feels out of place. It's footprints circling a house, each one pressed carefully into the earth. It's the soft tapping on a window, repeated just enough to make you doubt your own senses. These moments are easy to ignore, until they aren't. The pizza delivery story is a reminder of how quickly trust can turn to suspicion. A boy opens the door to a stranger, expecting nothing more than a hot meal. The exchange is routine, but a single question, "Are you alone?" cuts through that routine like a knife. It's a question that never should have been asked, and it's one that lingers long after the door closes. The boy's world, once familiar and safe, suddenly feels exposed. Locks and deadbolts become rituals, but the real damage is done in the mind, where doubt settles in and refuses to leave. In Idaho, the teenager's sense of isolation is supposed to be a shield. The house is surrounded by forest, far from neighbors or passing cars. But that same isolation becomes a weakness. The first sign that something is wrong is barely a sound, just the dog's nervous posture, the tapping at the windows of the movie room and the bar. When he finally steps outside, the footprints circling the house tell the story. Someone has been watching, moving from window to window, patient and deliberate. The forest, once a place of comfort, becomes a wall that hides the intentions of whoever is out there. The safety of home is gone, replaced by the knowledge that someone has chosen this place, this night, to hunt. For the college friends in South Carolina, vulnerability comes as a group, not alone. They arrive at the cabin seeking escape, laughter, and a break from responsibility. The cabin's decay is easy to overlook at first, until objects move, unease grows, and finally a stranger appears at the window. The man's presence is silent, almost passive, but the effect is immediate. The group's confidence crumbles. Numbers mean nothing when faced with someone who has been watching, waiting for the right moment. Even after they leave, the sense of violation follows them. The cabin listing disappears, the deposit is gone, and the local deputy's flat response, "Yeah, we've had some trouble with folks squatting up in those woods," offers no comfort or closure. What these stories reveal is that predators don't always announce themselves. In each case, the threat begins with something small, a question, a footprint, a tap at the glass. It's the slow erosion of certainty, the creeping realization that someone out there is watching, choosing, waiting. The fear is not just in what happens, but in how ordinary it all seems at first. The aftermath is where the real horror settles in. The boy from the pizza story is left wondering about the delivery man's true intentions. Was he just a stranger passing through, or was he part of something more sinister? The teenager in Idaho never learns who left those footprints or why they chose that night. The college friends will always question the cabin owner's role. Why did the listing vanish? And was the man outside connected to the place they'd rented? These unanswered questions are not just details left out of a story. They are the open doors and unlatched windows in the mind, places where fear slips in and refuses to leave. The psychological scars are as real as any physical threat. Research shows that the feeling of being watched or targeted leaves a mark. Hypervigilance, sleepless nights, routines reshaped by anxiety. The mind replays every detail, searching for clues, trying to make sense of what happened and how it might have been prevented. Even years later, the habits remain. Double-checking locks, glancing over shoulders, feeling a prickle of unease in the quiet moments before sleep. The stories here are not about far-fetched monsters or supernatural forces. They are reminders of real dangers that exist in the margins of everyday life. Home invasions, stalking, and predatory strangers are not confined to fiction or news headlines. They are possibilities that linger at the edge of routine. The sense of being watched, of having your movements tracked, your habits studied, is a primal fear, one that triggers the oldest parts of the brain. The amygdala flares, the body tenses, and the mind prepares for a threat it cannot see. What lingers is not just the memory of a frightening encounter, but the knowledge that safety is never guaranteed. The people in these stories did what most of us would do. They trusted that home, routine, or numbers would protect them. They followed the rules, locked the doors, stayed together. Yet each time, the threat found a way in. Not always through force, but through observation, patience, and the exploitation of small lapses. There is no easy resolution. The pizza man's identity remains unknown. The motive of the Idaho stalker is never uncovered. The true story behind the South Carolina cabin, whether the owner was complicit, negligent, or simply unlucky, remains just out of reach. These gaps are what give the stories their lasting power. We want answers, but sometimes there are none. That uncertainty is its own kind of horror. The lesson, if there is one, is not about living in fear, but about recognizing the limits of what we can control. Locks and alarms can help, but they are not infallible. The real challenge is learning to trust instincts, to pay attention to the small things that feel off, and to remember that vulnerability is a part of being human. The world is not always as safe as we hope, and sometimes the greatest danger is the one that blends into the background, unnoticed until it's too late. The stories you've just heard aren't warnings meant to scare you away from living your life. They are reminders that vigilance is not paranoia, and that sometimes the smallest detail, a question, a footprint, a face at the window, can mean everything. As you think back on these accounts, consider what it means to feel safe and what you might do if that feeling ever slips away. The real horror of vulnerability is not just in the moment of danger, but in the slow realization that the world can change in an instant and that security is never as certain as it seems. And while these stories may fade into the background as the days pass, the questions they raise linger in the quiet spaces of our minds, shaping the way we move through the world. Even in the places we know best, safety can turn out to be more fragile than we realize. These stories highlight how easily the familiar can become uncertain, and how quickly the unknown can find its way inside. Whether it's a silent figure outside a cabin window or the echo of footsteps on your porch, the shift from comfort to vulnerability can happen in an instant. Have you ever heard a knock late at night, or felt eyes on you when you thought you were alone? Share your story in the comments below. For more true accounts that linger long after the screen goes dark, subscribe to the channel. And next time you answer the door, remember the delivery man's question. Are you alone here?